We have looked at three parts of the new light that have come in recent times in Adventism. The last one is an interesting one. Over the past decade, I've been receiving a large number of papers and open letters and booklets on one theme: the necessity of observing the national festivals or feasts given to the Hebrews along with the Sabbath days connected with those feasts. This movement has been gathering some momentum among those seriously preparing for final events. Now, much has been written and spoken on this subject. It's impossible to cover everything in one meeting. There's a fair amount of technical material here based on language usage and historical practices. So I'm going to address the major issues, hopefully enough to make final, clear decisions. As in previous subjects, the truth is at the basis of the claims for the feast days. God gave Israel a marvelous sequence of observances throughout the year to teach the major lessons of the plan of salvation. For instance, how God is handling the great controversy, how Satan would be defeated. And every year, Israel was to repeat these lessons, so every new generation would understand the issues in the great controversy, and the torch of truth would be passed on. It was an outstanding teaching tool. And because of apostasy in the Christian church and animosity to everything Jewish, these observances have been completely forgotten, and they've been replaced with things like Christmas and Easter and even Halloween. If Christians would have remembered the Hebrew feasts, it would have been easy to understand the dual aspects of the atonement, the reasons for the judgment, and Christ's new work since 1844. If Seventh-day Adventists would have studied the feasts more carefully, we would not be in confusion today about righteousness by faith, the judgment, the purpose of the last generation. The feasts were and are tremendous teaching tools for God's people and can be very useful today. But make no mistake, those promoting the feasts are saying much more than this. The new claims, these new claims, are the problem I'm addressing today. For instance, quote, "Those who go through the end and are translated will be teaching the statutes and judgments. The law is the 10 Commandments and the statutes. It is also the fundamental teaching which the 144,000 must embrace if they are to give the loud cry. The antediluvians were destroyed for not keeping the statutes, and this will be the ultimate factor which brings the end destruction upon mankind. The 144,000 will teach the statutes in the last days. The statute message is the very heart of the message carried in the loud cry to the world." Statutes and judgments. Since the feasts are part of the statutes, we're being told that only feast keepers will be translated, and it is necessary to be part of the 144,000. And this is the heart of our final message to the world. So, it is much more than a teaching tool. It has become the final test issue by which the 144,000 will receive the seal of God. For instance, regarding the hailstones which will fall in the 7th plague, quote, "God now stones with hail those who refuse to keep his holy days." So, number one, the claim is made that the feasts were part of the heavenly sanctuary before Lucifer fell, and they were part of the creation of earth before sin, and it is based on the Hebrew word moed, which can have a number of meanings: appointment, festival, assembly, congregation, appointed time. So it is completely improper to assume that whenever the word moed is used, it refers to the feasts. The meaning varies according to the context and the subject discussed. For instance, let's just take a simple illustration of this. In the book of Lamentations, very short book after Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 1. Verse 15. Verse 15. This is the word moed used here. "The Lord hath trodden under foot all my mighty men in the midst of me. He hath called an assembly," moed, against me to crush my young men. Here, the assembly, the Moed, is an assembly of Israel's adversaries, the ones who were fighting against God. There's another example of this in the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 14 and verse 10. But all the congregation bade stone them, that is, Joshua and Caleb, with stones. All the congregation bade stone them with stones. Guess what? The word congregation is moed. Has nothing to do with the festivals or the feasts. And you can find the same thing in Jeremiah 8:7 and Hosea 2:9. So the claim that is being made that since the plan of redemption was laid at the foundation of the world and the feasts are unfolding of the plan of redemption, therefore the feasts were establishing at creation, that's an interesting deduction. Just one problem. There's no inspired evidence that the feasts existed before Sinai, and the word moed cannot be used to prove their existence. The Passover began with the 10th plague in Egypt. Its purpose was to commemorate the deliverance from slavery. The Day of Atonement began with the yearly cycle connected with the tabernacle and the high priest at Mount Sinai. The Feast of Tabernacles pointed to their rest in Canaan after their enemies had been destroyed, and all of these were connected with the Hebrew chosen people after Sinai. There is no evidence of existence before Moses. Number two, there are many statements from Ellen White which are said to prove feast-keeping. Here's one. In these last days there is a call from heaven inviting you to keep the statutes and ordinances of the Lord. That's volume 2 of Signs of the Times, page 184. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. From Review and Herald, volume 5, page 83. Now, the most famous statement is in Review and Herald, May 6, 1875. And I want to spend a little bit of time on that particular description here. God's people were privileged with a twofold system of law, the moral and the ceremonial. So let's look at what we're talking about here. In consequence of continual transgression, the moral law was repeated in awful grandeur from Sinai. Christ gave to Moses religious precepts which were to govern the everyday life. These statutes, here's the word, statutes were explicitly given to guard the Ten Commandments. They were not shadowy types, ceremonial law, to pass away with the death of Christ. They were to be binding upon men in every age as long as time should last. These commands were enforced by the power of the moral law, and they clearly and definitely explained that law. So notice carefully, the moral law was given by God at Sinai. And then God gave to Moses the statutes, the religious precepts which were to govern the everyday life. And so there we have a specific statement of the difference between the moral law and the statutes. So the statutes are not the moral law, but application of the moral law to the specific circumstances, which applications can change as circumstances change, such as the laws regulating slavery. They were also part of these statutes that God was giving to them at this time. She continues, the statutes and judgments specifying the duty of man to his fellow men were full of important instruction, defining and simplifying the principles of the moral law for the purpose of increasing religious knowledge and of preserving God's chosen people distinct and separate from idolatrous nations. The statutes concerning marriage, inheritance, and strict justice in dealing with one another were peculiar and contrary to the customs and manners of other nations, and were designed of God to keep his people separate from other nations. The necessity of this to preserve the people of God from becoming like the nations who had not the love and fear of God is the same in this corrupt age, when the transgression of God's law prevails and idolatry exists to a fearful extent. If ancient Israel needed such security, we need it more to keep us from being utterly confounded with the transgressors of God's law. The hearts of men are so prone to depart from God that there is a necessity of restraint and discipline. So that seems to be the strongest evidence that we need to observe the statutes, because they did not pass away as the ceremonial law did. They guarded the moral law. So the statutes were a subset of the moral law. The moral law is eternal. The statutes began at Sinai, and therefore they would only be valid as long as there was a theocracy, as long as God was guiding his people step by step. So there is the very famous statement about the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the statutes. And this, of course, is taken from Review and Herald, May 6, 1875. Now here's the interesting point. As we deal with this, as we try to understand it, we must make sure that we are understanding these things correctly. Moral law first, ceremonial law second, and then a third category of laws that is being described here at this point. She calls them statutes and judgments, and notice carefully what they are. They are not the Ten Commandments. They are not the moral law. They were to guard the moral law. They could not be part of the moral law if they were given to guard it. They were not part of the ceremonial law, not shadowy types to pass away with the death of Christ. They were to govern the everyday life. They were for the purpose of protecting life. They specify the duty of man to God and to his fellow men. They define and simplify the principles of the moral law. They apply to marriage. They apply to inheritance. They apply to strict justice in business affairs. They were to keep the people from following the customs of other nations. They were to be as binding upon all men in all ages as long as time should last. All right. That's the essence of these statutes as described. The laws of inheritance, for instance, that's the buying and selling of land. That happened to be regulated by the Jubilee year in Leviticus 25. There were precise rules on how to redeem property. But there's no evidence that Ellen White or any of our pioneers followed these precise rules. Principles, yes. Rules, no. These are applying and enforcing the principles of the moral law. And these are found in Exodus 21 and on to 23. And here's the key point. There is nothing about the three feasts in which all males were come to the tabernacle. So the clearest statement that Ellen White makes on the purpose and perpetuity of the statutes makes no reference to the feasts or the Sabbath days connected with those feasts. There simply is no connection there at all. This is an interpretive deduction that these principles were not only principles, but exact rules that were to be followed during our time today. Now let's just take a look at some of these statutes that people are concerned about in our time today. Leviticus chapter 7, verse 34. One of the statutes that God had given to Israel to protect and prevent them from going astray in keeping the moral law. Leviticus chapter 7, verse 34. For the wave breast and the heave shoulder have I taken of the children of Israel from off the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them unto Aaron the priest and to his sons by a statute forever from among the children of Israel. So a statute is a certain way of offering one of the offerings, the sacrifices, in the peace offerings. So that's an interesting way of talking about the statutes. Let's look at another one. Exodus chapter 30, verses 19 to 21. Exodus chapter 30, verses 19 to 21. For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet therein when they go into the tabernacle of the congregation. They shall wash with water that they die not, or when they come near to the altar to minister to burnt offering made by fire unto the Lord. So shall they wash their hands and their feet that they die not, and it shall be a statute forever to them, even to him and to his seed throughout their generations. So a statute is about Aaron and his sons washing when they go into the tabernacle of the Lord. A statute once again. And let's try another one. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 27. Ye shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. That is a statute. You should not cut the corners of the beard that you are growing. Here's another one. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments and do them. I am the Lord. This is part of the statutes. Let's take a quick look at one more. Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15, verses 38 and 39. Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look about it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them. All right? So here we have another statute, another command that we're dealing with. Ribbon of blue in all of our garments. Well, it is suggested, even by those who believe in the feast days, that we're not to follow these specific commands, but look for the principle behind the command. And I agree. The only possible conclusion is that the principles of the statutes are binding as long as time should last, even though the details may change because we are no longer under a theocracy. So we look for the principle behind the specific feast day commands, and we learn the lessons of the feasts, and we practice their principles. That's what we should be doing today. Number 3, Ellen White said, well would it be for us to have a Feast of Tabernacles. Review and Herald, November 17, 1895. Shall we not gather our forces together and come up to the Feast of Tabernacles? Therefore, come to the camp meeting, even though you have to make a sacrifice to do so. Bible Echo, December 8, 1893. Now that camp meeting happened to be in December, and she called it a Feast of Tabernacles. Not at the right time, but at a time of their own choosing. So it was not a commemorative event of something in the past, but an evangelistic effort. Another one. Then shall your life henceforth be a continual Feast of Tabernacles, a continual thank offering. Manuscript Releases, Volume 18, page 270. James White wrote about camp meeting time. These annual Feasts of Tabernacles are gatherings of the greatest importance. Signs of the Times, June 8, 1876. So, Feast of Tabernacles is equivalent to camp meetings in the minds of James and Ellen White. Number 4, since it's very clear that Ellen White did not observe the feasts and the annual Sabbaths. There's some explanation that has to be given for why God's end-time prophet did not understand something which is very necessary for salvation. The Holy Spirit, we are told, did not allow Daniel to fully understand what he wrote. The same happened to Mrs. White with God's festivals. Now, Daniel was dealing with sealed prophecies to be understood only 2,300 years later, while Ellen White was explaining these prophecies and writing much about statutes and ceremonies. For Ellen White, the feasts were equal to the holy convocations, the camp meetings, Testimonies, Volume 6, page 70, and there is nothing about the appointed times for these convocations. Here's another attempt to explain why Ellen White didn't do it. Like Luther was not given the Sabbath, Ellen White was not given all the light on God's feasts. Well, there's a clear admission of the evidence lacking for the feasts in the writings of Ellen White. But notice, Luther was in great darkness, did not have the light on many subjects. Is Ellen White a prophet of God for the final generation as blind, as uninspired Luther regarding the tests for the seal of God? As in the other subjects, the name of God, the Trinity, and futurism, the claim is made that Ellen White just didn't understand. We have more light than she. We must go farther than the inspired mouthpiece for God went to learn God's will for us today. We know more than the prophet. Number 5, the claim is made that Jesus kept the annual feasts. Well, listen to this. Jesus traveled up and down the breadth of the land, giving his invitation to the feast. That sounds like he was keeping the feasts. That's Review and Herald, July 7, 1896. All right? The Feast of Tabernacles. What is that? And what does it mean? Desire of Ages, page 450. Since the healing at Bethesda, he had not attended the national gatherings. His apparent neglect of the great religious assemblies. He himself seemed to be indifferent to the services which had been divinely established. Page 451. For many months he had been absent from the feasts. So apparently he didn't attend all of the feasts that he was required to attend. It's interesting because the command in Deuteronomy 18 verse 16, there's a very specific command to keep the 3 feasts in Jerusalem by all the males of the land. If this was part of the moral law and is crucial for us today, then it's not optional any more than the seventh-day Sabbath is optional. And yet Jesus did not go to all of the feasts, while as his custom was, on every Sabbath day he was in the synagogue. Number 6. Desire of Ages 652 says, during the last Passover supper, the national festival of the Jews was to pass away forever. Now, this is suggested that this refers only to the sacrifices on Passover Day, not to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Acts of the Apostles 390 and 391, Paul tarried to keep the Passover during the 8 days of the feast. What is the Passover? 1 day or 8 days? Paul tarried to keep the Passover during the 8 days of the feast. Let's look briefly at Luke 22 and verse 1 on this subject of whether or not the feast was 8 days or 1 day. Luke 22, verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. The entire feast is called the Passover, the feast of unleavened bread, although the Passover meal was only on the first day. Ezekiel, let's just take a look at it. Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 21. Ezekiel 45, verse 21. In the first month, On the 14th day of the month ye shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. That's specific. The Passover, a feast of 7 days. That's how long it lasted. In Acts chapter 12, so with this, you just make sure we understand this point clearly. Acts chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. And because he saw, this is Herod, it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. Then were the days of unleavened bread. All right, so this is Peter being taken by Herod during this particular time and being held in captivity. Ellen White, this was virtually the last Passover that was ever to be celebrated, talking about the one with Jesus. For type was to meet antitype in the slaying of the Lamb of God for the sins of the world, but at the crucifixion type meant antitype, and the typical system there ceased. That I may know him, page 17. This is the last Passover that was ever celebrated as a command of God. And so therefore we have this. The typical service and the ceremonies connected with them were abolished at the cross. Bible Commentary, Volume 6, page 1061. So Jesus did not keep the feasts, all of them, and it is not just one day that was to pass away forever, but the entire feast of unleavened bread. Number 7. The claim is made that only the sacrifices ended while the feast days continued. From Signs of the Times, July 29, 1886. After the crucifixion, it was a denial of Christ for the Jews to continue to offer the burnt offerings and sacrifices which were typical of his death. So after the crucifixion, it would be a denial of Christ to continue to offer the sacrifices. No sacrifices were acceptable after Christ's death. Commenting on the Jerusalem Council, from Sketches of the Life in the Life of Paul, page 121, the council had decided that the converts from the Jewish church might observe the ordinances of the Mosaic law if they chose, while those ordinances should not be made obligatory upon converts from the Gentiles. So it was decided that those among the Jews who wanted to keep the ordinances of the Mosaic law, they could. But this could not refer to the sacrifices, because no one, Jews or Gentiles, could offer sacrifices after that time. The only things which could be continued, which would be by choice, would be the other ordinances of the Mosaic law. Now, especially about circumcision, but it applied to other ordinances also. This statement from A Story of Redemption, page 306, Paul knew that the typical ceremonies must soon altogether cease. The typical ceremonies must soon altogether cease. This is after the death of Christ and before the destruction of the Jewish nation. So the Jewish converts could continue to keep these feasts if they chose, but it was not necessary. At this council, something surely would have been said about the feasts if they were still binding at this time and still absolutely a law that had to be kept. In the book Christ Triumphant, page 281, many who at that time united in the services of the Passover never again had a part in them. Light was to shine into their hearts. Never again would they have that would be a part of them. Number 8, Paul did keep the Passover with his converts at Philippi. That's Acts chapter 20, verse 6. And Pentecost is mentioned. Why did he do that? I think it was for the same reason that he took the purification vow in the temple. Let's just take a look at that. Acts 21, verse 24. Then take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things whereof they are informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou walkest orderly and keepest the law. Why did he do this purification ceremony of the Jews in the statutes that had been previously set up for the Jews? To reach the hearts of faithful Jews, to reach their hearts. From the life of Paul, sketches from the life of Paul, page 105, Paul did not bind himself nor his converts to the ceremonies and customs of the Jews with their varied forms, types, and sacrifices. On page 161, he complied with their rules and ordinances. So he complied with their rules and ordinances. Why? So that he could reach their hearts and they would listen to him. That was his motivation. The council had decided that the Jewish converts could keep the Mosaic law if they chose, so Paul kept the Passover with the Jewish and Gentile converts as a sign of unity. The years 34 to 70 A.D., those years were a transition time between the Jewish laws and customs and Christian observances. Paul kept some Jewish laws which were not mandatory after Christ's death. Interesting that John, as he writes, refers to the feasts of the Jews in several places, the feasts of the Jews. Number 9. The SDA pioneers. J.N. Andrews, when that city was destroyed, the complete cessation of their feasts, and as a consequence of the annual Sabbaths, which were specified days in those feasts, must occur. The Jewish festivals were utterly extinguished with the final destruction of Jerusalem. That's in History of the Sabbath, page 90. Joseph Bates wrote this: when their feasts cease to be binding on them, these Sabbaths must also. That's Seventh-day Sabbath, page 14. Uriah Smith: the feast days, new moons, and ceremonial Sabbaths were to cease at the cross. Biblical Institute, page 139. James White: new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths of the Jewish laws ceased. Review and Herald, March 7, 1854. So those are pretty clear evidences that our pioneers did not see them as mandatory. Number 10, 3 primary feasts were to be observed at the temple. They could not be observed in captivity. They were closely tied to the Israelites' agricultural calendar, with the 13th month added when it was needed. So if it could not be kept in captivity, how can we keep them in the United States? And interestingly, the first fruits of the harvest is 6 months later in the southern hemisphere. In Leviticus 23 seems to be the strongest arguing point about the fact that these feasts are the same as the Sabbath. And there are some real important distinctions between the Sabbaths, the annual Sabbaths, and the weekly Sabbath, even in Leviticus 23. In verse 2, for instance, speak unto the children of Israel, saying to them concerning the feasts of the Lord. That's Moed, and that is where it does refer to feasts, which ye shall proclaim to be my holy convocations, even these are my feasts. Okay, so there we're dealing with the feasts as they were appointed, an appointed time. And then in verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So in verse 2, we're talking about the annual feast. In verse 3, we're talking about the weekly Sabbath. Now notice something interesting here. It says that on the Sabbath day, no work shall be done. No work shall be done. And then as you read through the feasts of the Lord in verse 4 and onward, it says in verse 7, ye shall do no servile work. That's a different phrase in the original language. It means laborious work in our occupations. In verse 3 about the Sabbath, no work is to be done. In the feast days, no laborious occupational work is to be done. Now go to verses 37 and 38 in this same chapter. These are the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering, a meat offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, everything upon his day, beside the Sabbaths of the Lord. Beside the Sabbaths of the Lord. So the moed, the feasts, are separate from the Sabbaths of the Lord. The Sabbath of the Lord is never used of the feasts. That is a specific phrase used only for the seventh-day Sabbath. The only Sabbath that God ever instructed his people to keep holy is the seventh-day Sabbath. My Sabbaths, he called them. The seventh-day Sabbath. When God refers to the annual Sabbaths, he refers to them as your Sabbaths. The phrasing, the words here are very important as a distinction between these feasts and the Sabbath day. Number 12. The claim is that the feasts can be separated from the sacrifices. You can keep the feasts, but not the sacrifices. The Hebrew word chak is one of the words by which the feasts are called, and it literally refers to the sacrificial victim. In fact, you can read that in Exodus chapter 23, verse 18. Exodus chapter 23, verse 18. Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice, chak, with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. So that word is referring to the sacrificial victim, and it also refers to the feasts. The feasts were extensions of the sacrificial animals, and maybe they just couldn't exist without them. The last point I want to mention is something of interest because of modern interpretations these days. The study of the feasts teach valuable lessons about the plan of salvation, and our time is well spent in studying them in depth to make them a test of obedience on the same level as the seventh-day Sabbath is placing man-made rules above the law of God in the same way that the Sunday tradition usurps the authority of the lawgiver. Any human rule which is not clearly stated in inspiration is stealing glory from God and exalting human reason. Life and death issues do not need inferences drawn from words and possible meanings, because God makes those things crystal clear, life and death issues. For instance, this statement was made by Ellen White in Selected Messages, Volume 2, 34 and 35, about another issue. They were pressed beyond measure to receive the message of error. It was represented to them that unless they did this, they would be lost. And that's the same kind of thinking which is being applied now to the feast days. If we don't observe them, we will be lost. In the book, which is one of the major books of those who are keeping the feast, God's Holidays, there are some interesting references. Quote, "Our old natures are taken away, and our new natures are given to us during the latter rain, during the great tribulation. Our new nature is given to us when our sins are blotted out during the latter rain." And this is referring to the condition of sinlessness in which Adam lived. The only way God's people will not sin is if they have been given the perfect nature. Our very nature and being is still sin. Even when we are not willfully sinning, we are in a state of sin. Our sinful nature has to be changed before probation closes forever. Our sinful natures have to be changed, or we will not be able to stand for one moment after the close of probation without sinning. Now, these are taken from this book, God's Holidays, which is used extensively in this. Now, there are some very serious problems here. We are talking about being born sinners with a sinful nature, and as long as we have this sinful nature, we are going to be sinning. That is original sin. And the only way that we will be able to stop sinning is if we are given new natures during the time of the latter rain and the great tribulation. That's holy flesh. Ellen White wrote about that. All may now obtain holy hearts, but it is not correct to claim in this life to have holy flesh. No human being on the earth has holy flesh. It is an impossibility. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 32. On page 33, when human beings receive holy flesh, they will not remain on the earth, but they will be taken to heaven. In Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 32, let this phase of doctrine be carried a little farther, and it will lead to the claim that its advocates cannot sin. And so contrast this again with the book God's Holidays. We must reach Adam's pre-fall nature before the second coming. The only way they can be holy is if he has given them their new nature. As long as we have a sinful nature, we are defiled. Therefore, when God's people are sealed, the sinful nature must be removed from them. They are no longer tempted by evil. So here, apparently, this idea of the feast has morphed into an idea which is very similar to evangelicals teaching that we are born sinners and that we will continue to sin as long as we have a sinful nature. A blending of one error into a more serious error after that. Well, what are we dealing with in all of this? What is the bottom line here? It is not coincidence that several unrelated issues are coming together in the belief system of some Adventists. Number one, only the Hebrew names for God and Christ may be used. Number two, the Holy Spirit is not a person. Christ is generated or born from the Father. Number three, the future applications of the prophecies have already been fulfilled in the past, but they must be fulfilled again in the future. Number four, the keeping of the feasts and the Sabbaths are connected with them and must be kept. Faithful Adventists have become very frustrated with the long delay in the final events and with the continuing decline in the visible remnant church. So there must be some new light which will hold the key to revival and reformation and will begin the final countdown to the second coming. Just like with all things concerning us these days, God foresaw and He warned us about this tendency that is coming into our world today. And Ellen White has some important counsel for us on this subject. It was an article entitled, Be of One Mind, Review and Herald, May 29, 1888. Erroneous ideas will be brought into the work and presented as a part of the truth to the people, but everything that God has not connected with the truth will only serve to weaken the message and lessen the force of its claims. They, referring to some individuals, chose to follow their own course until the third angel's message becomes a thing of minor importance, and finally it loses all its value. The doctrine of truth will be mingled with error, and the result will be that those who are taught will cherish error as they do the truth. It will be more difficult to reach and correct their errors than to bring a company into the truth from the darkness of complete ignorance of the truth. It would have been better if they had not heard this mingling of the truth with falsehood. More harm can be done by one who has a mixture of truth and error than many who teach the whole truth can undo and correct. There were those in Paul's day who were constantly dwelling upon circumcision, and they could bring plenty of proof from the Bible to show its obligation on the Jews. Instead of catching up every new and fanciful interpretation of the Bible, cling to the message. It is the third angel's message that bears the true test to the people. Satan will lead men to manufacture false tests and thus seek to obscure the value of and make of none effect the message of truth. The commandment of God that has been almost universally made void is the testing truth for this time. The Sabbath of Jehovah is to be brought to the attention of the world, but all man-made tests will divert the mind from the great and important doctrines that constitute the present truth. From Christ Triumphant, page 363. We should be careful about receiving everything termed new light. I have been shown that it is the device of the enemy to divert minds to some obscure or unimportant point, something that is not fully revealed or is not essential to salvation. Satan's object is accomplished just as surely when people run ahead of Christ and do the work he has never entrusted to their hands, as when they remain in the Laodicean state, lukewarm, feeling rich and increased with goods and in need of nothing. The two classes are equally stumbling blocks. Some zealous ones who are aiming and straining every energy for originality have made a grave mistake in trying to get something startling, wonderful, entrancing before the people, something that they think others do not comprehend, but often they do not themselves know what they are talking about. Satan's angels are wise to do evil, and they will create that which some will claim to be advanced light and will proclaim it as new and wonderful. Yet while in some respects the message may be truth, it will be mingled with human inventions and will teach for doctrine the commandments of men. Many apparently good things are specious devices of the enemy to lead souls in a path that lies so close to the path of truth that it will be scarcely distinguishable from it. Unbelievers seek to frame some excuse for not receiving the truth as it is in Jesus. Where these differences exist among us, those who stand outside will say, "It will be time enough for us to believe as you do when you can agree among yourselves as to what constitutes truth." My friends, Satan does not care how he traps God's people in worldliness or Laodiceanism or foreign things to take our attention away from the real test for the remnant. There's only one test at the end time in Scripture: obedience to God's commandments and the faith of Jesus. In other words, righteousness by faith. Now that's not as glamorous or as exciting as in researching the names of God or the Trinity or the prophecies or the Hebrew observances. But being part of the 144,000 is about the surrender of our heart, victory over all sin, and daily walking with God as Enoch did. The 144,000 are more about character than about knowledge. God will teach us what we need to know and where we have made our mistakes. Let us keep our focus clear and not be sidetracked with new light which isn't new and isn't light.